So first we'll talk about inclusion and exclusion policy in multi-level caches. So currently we are looking at L1 and L2 caches, the two levels of hierarchy, and we'll discuss what is meant by an inclusive policy for caches. So we are assuming here that both L1 and L2 are set associative caches, not direct mapped caches. The reason will be evident in the next slide. And we are assuming also that the number of ways in L2 is much greater than number of ways in L1. So P is the processor, and this is an initial state wherein both the caches are empty. There's nothing in both the caches, and we're yet to start fetching in data into the cache. So now let us assume that the processor requested for data for a certain memory location X. So now this data is not present in the L1 cache, so it is a miss, and it's a miss also in L2. So this is the state. It's a miss in both L1 and L2. There's nothing in both of them. So what we do in inclusive policy is that we bring in the data of M of X into L2 as well as L1. So this means that whatever data is present in L1 has to be present in L2. That is what is meant by inclusion. So whatever data is present in L1 has to be present in L2 as well. So now let us say that we now see a scenario wherein the processor requests for data from an address location Y, and that is also a cache miss from both L1 and L2. So now Y is brought in, M of Y to be precise, the data in address location Y is brought into L2, and it's also brought into L1. So now let us assume that there is a scenario wherein this M of X has to be evicted from L1 because another data has to come in. So this is following, let us say, a least recently used policy, wherein the block which was least recently accessed has to be evicted or removed or replaced from the cache. So if a new data has to be brought in, we have to replace one of these two. And let us assume that we are following the LRU policy where we'll replace the least recently used data. So we're going to evict or remove X. So what we do in inclusive policy is that we remove X from L1, but then we let it remain in L2. So we've removed M of X from L1, but we've retained that in L2. So this still does not violate the inclusion principle, because in inclusion, we only say that whatever is present in L1 has to be also present in L2. So one of the key advantages of retaining this X in L2 is that the next time a processor requests for this M of X, although it is an L1 miss, it can be easily accessed from L2. So that is one of the key advantages. One of the advantages of having an inclusive policy is that you bring in data to both of these caches, but then when you evict it from L1, you retain it in L2, so that it can be a hit in L2 if at all the processor needs it. So now the last principle in this policy is that whenever you evict the data from L2, so let us say, for example, that this M of Y has to be evicted from L2. So then you cannot just evict it from L2 and retain it in L1, because following the policy of inclusion, whatever is present in L1 has to be also present in L2. So by going by that principle, if you evict Y from L2, you also have to evict that from L1. So this is what is called as back invalidation, or in other words, what you do is you just make that block invalid in L1. So the moment you make that invalid, it's as good as not present. So rather than evicting it, you can just make it invalid, and that is why it is called back invalidation. So these are the principles in the inclusive policy. So essentially every block that is existing in the first level cache should also exist in the next level. So going by that principle, if you have an L3 cache, you should have whatever content you have in L1, in L2 and L3. And similarly, if L2 and L3 follow inclusion, whatever is present in L2 also should be present in L3, and so on. So which of the processors follow this kind of an inclusion policy? Intel processors follow inclusive policy for L2 and L3 caches. So let's just look at another example. So here I've explicitly shown that it's a set associative cache. So we have X and Y going into the same index of the first level. This is the first level cache L1 and L2 cache. So let us say we get in X and get in Y into the same index. So they're going to go into the same index in L2 as well as going to the same index in L1. So when Z is brought in, there is, and it's also going into the same index or same set. There's no space in the same set. So you have to evict one of these, and we evict X because that was least recently used, and we bring in Z. And there is space here in L2, so you put in Z here. Similarly, when you bring in A, you're going to evict Y and replace it with A, and we assign A to the fourth way in this L2 cache. Now, what is going to happen when B comes in at this point in time? So how do you take care of inclusion and provide a place for B? So you can work this out and we'll discuss it. So the next policy is the exclusive policy. So just the opposite of inclusive. So we start with the same initial state where there is nothing in the cache. We bring in X. So when you bring in X, of course, it is the data which corresponds to the address location X. So when you bring in that data into an exclusive cache, you bring it just into L1 and not into L2. And we bring it into L1 obviously because the processor has to access it faster, and therefore you bring all the data into L1 first. And then let's say you have to access Y next. We bring in Y into L1 and not into L2. So this is exactly just the opposite of inclusive. So the data that is present in L1 will not be present in L2. So the lower level cache contains only blocks that are not present in the higher level cache. So then that means that L1 is exclusive of L2. So now let us say that we have to evict X and we have to bring in Y. Sorry, bring in A. So we have to evict X and bring in A. So at this point in time, you're going to evict X, but then we're going to put it in L2. So you're replacing X in L1 and bringing in A, but then at the same time, we're moving this block into L2. And this is one of the ways in which L2 gets filled, because whatever you bring in always fills up L1. So one of the ways in which you fill up L2 is when the data gets evicted from L1. And is there any advantage, or why are we doing this? Why are we evicting the block? Why are we placing the evicted block from L1 into L2? Is there an advantage of doing this? So this is something again which you can think about. And the next part. So let us say we have the next access, which is Z, and let us assume that it is not present in L1, but it is present in L2. And such a scenario can exist because it's an exclusive cache. And let us assume that this Z is now a hit in L2. So what we do is we bring in Z from L2 into L1. So we move this data from L2 to L1. So we bring in Z here, and to maintain exclusion, we have to eliminate it from L2. Now this applies equally to an inclusive cache as well. So if such a scenario existed in an inclusive cache, we would bring in Z into L1, but retain it in L1. So in case of an inclusive cache, we would move Z and we'll keep Z in L2 as well. So this would be the case in an inclusive cache, whereas in an exclusive cache, we would eliminate it from L2. An example of such a cache is typically followed by AMD. AMD follows an exclusive cache principle. AMD Opteron has a 512 KB L2 cache, which is exclusive of L1. So typically Intel follows an inclusive policy and AMD follows an exclusive policy. There's also something in between, which is called non-inclusive and non-exclusive policy. So here, up till this point in time, it behaves the same as inclusive. So whenever you bring in data, you bring in both into L1 and L2. So that is very similar to the inclusive policy. And then when you evict the data from L1, let us just go back to the inclusive policy. So when you were eliminating X from L1, you were retaining it in L2. So that is again very similar here in this non-inclusive, non-exclusive policy. But later, when the time comes that you have to evict Y from L2, so let us say you have to evict Y from L2. What we were doing in the inclusive policy was that we were back invalidating it and eliminating it from L1 as well. So when you have to evict from L2, you were back invalidating and evicting it from L1 also. That was to maintain inclusion. So now in this policy, let us call it 9. So you eliminate Y from L2, but then you do not back invalidate it, but we retain it in L1. So there is no back invalidation and we retain it in L1, even if it is not present in L2. So up till this point, it is like inclusive policy, and after this point, it is not following the inclusive policy. And this is called as non-inclusive, non-exclusive policies. It might be beneficial sometimes because in inclusive policy, when you do back invalidation, and let us say we invalidated Y and the next access was to Y, then we have lost it in L1 and we've also lost it in L2. So that will be a major disadvantage there. So by retaining it in L1, we have some advantage here in case you access Y again. So this is again followed by AMD in their L3 cache. They followed a non-inclusive, non-exclusive policy. Again, not all processors by AMD will follow a certain policy. Some of them might follow an exclusive and some of them might follow this 9 policy.